Excuse me? Excuse me. Enough about Alice Paul. I'm trying to rest in peace, and people keep bringing up her name. It's like the story of the princess and the pea. Only for me, Alice Paul is like a very large boulder interfering with my respite. While I do admire her dedication, I will never condone her behaviors. Alice's time in England introduced her to the aggressive and militant tactics of the British suffrage movement. When she embraced those tactics, I can only imagine that she cast aside her Quaker upbringing. The escapades of women like Christabel Pankhurst were both infamous and rightly terrifying. We, members of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, did not wish us to be connected in any way to our sisters across the sea. We called ourselves suffragists and emphatically rejected the term suffragette. And then Alice Paul returned to the United States. When I welcomed Alice and Lucy Burns into Nassau, I was not aware of how divergent their beliefs were. I'm sure that not every woman in Nassau embraced my winning plan, but they respected my leadership and were confident that I would get us to our goal of woman suffrage. Alice was full of ideas for our movement, and I'm willing to try different approaches as long as they are in concert with our goals and strategies for achieving them. She asked to be allowed to organize a suffrage parade to be held in Washington, D.C. at the time of President Wilson's inauguration, thus ensuring maximum press attention. We accepted her offer, and when she promised to raise the necessary funds, we gave her the title of Chairman of the Congressional Committee. The parade was a disaster. And while I do not hold her completely responsible for the chaos, I believe that she did not foster the support that one would need so that the parade would be a civil one. And this was not the sort of publicity that we wanted. After that debacle, I was finding it difficult to rein Alice in. So Alice and I publicly clashed in November 1913 during the Nassau Convention. Alice was speaking to the convention about her work as head of the Congressional Committee and attempting to gain support from the organization for an amendment to the Constitution, which would ensure woman suffrage. Contrary to our strategy, which was to gain suffrage for individual states, building a much stronger and broader support for the eventual passage of a national amendment. As she spoke proudly about her great triumph gaining publicity, whether we wanted it or not, as well as her successful fundraising efforts, I was provoked. I stood up during the speech and criticized Alice, saying that she was taking too much credit for a movement that she had only recently joined. Many of us had been working for suffrage for decades, and it seems as though she was completely ignoring all of our headway. She didn't know her place. Thus, our rift was established, and Alice split from Nassau. She formed the National Woman's Party, and among other radical behaviors, they staged the first ever picketing of the White House. When our nation was at war, their members carried banners that cried, "Kaiser Wilson, how long must women wait for liberty?" While I will admit to their courage, I felt these tactics were reckless and would stand in the way of women's suffrage. We did not wish to alienate President Wilson. We needed his support. As always, I did not feel that Alice and her party had a realistic understanding of political politics. One should not go crashing into the crusade like a bull in a china shop. And it wasn't as if we weren't making headway using my future-reaching and consistent measures for decisions regarding tactics. I think the Women's Party operated with a try-anything tactic. I was particularly adverse to partisanship and picketing. For example, Alice and her allies sought to go after all Democrats, which failed to distinguish between those who were in support of suffrage and those who were against it. As for picketing, it had a negative impact on the public and Congress, neither of which did we wish to alienate. While they were stirring up Washington and focusing on the federal amendment, we continued the state-by-state campaign for women's suffrage. A major state was next, New York. My general plan of action is one of optimistic detail augmented with elbow grease. For New York, we needed to roll up our sleeves and set our mind to making history and fight for liberty, such that the whole world would respect our sex and not think of us as hysterical, out of control females. Women's suffrage opposition posited that women were likely to be affected by gusts and waves of sentiment, and that their emotional temperament made them liable to it. Alice's party reinforced this premise. We needed calm and focused strategies for success in New York. The Empire State stood first in population, wealth, and national prestige, with 10 million inhabitants, 1/10 of the nation. Of all the state suffrage campaigns, success in New York would be momentous. We had two obstacles to overcome. Democratic Tammany Hall, the oldest political machine in the country, dating back to 1789, was the undisputed control in New York City. The Republican Party controlled the rest of the state. Unless they both gave the all-clear signal for a suffrage campaign, there would not be one. Neither party was in the faintest degree friendly to enfranchising women. In fact, both detested the idea. Nothing but an overwhelming demonstration of strength would make any impression on these two formidable groups. Strength and finesse, something that Alice did not seem to understand, were our plan of action. We had a two-pronged approach. One was to convert the city of New York, with 6 million inhabitants. There, we had a task much greater than many of the suffrage campaigns in other states. We needed systemic activity. 63 assembly district leaders and 2,000 election district captains, with a definitive task of converting a certain number of men and women to support women's suffrage. Men have evolved this strategy after a century of political experience as the best one for campaign purposes. Why should we use a plan any less thoroughgoing? The second prong was the state campaign, where I made an organizing tour in 1914. In 5 weeks, I visited 52 of the 62 counties, held 90 meetings, and raised $20,000. The swell continued into 1915 as we conducted 10,300 rallies with speeches in counties across the state, and even earnest workers going into the fields to speak to farmers personally. On Mother's Day, suffrage sermons were heard in churches. If a preacher refused, we handed out brochures on the church steps. All in all, we distributed over 7 million leaflets during that campaign. On the 4th of July, the Woman's Declaration of Independence, drafted at Seneca Falls, was read from the courthouse steps of every county seat in New York. At the end of shifts in factories, speakers addressed workers. These are only a few samples of how we conducted that campaign. It was all about information and relationship building. In October 1915, prior to the November vote, the final feature of the campaign was a 3-mile parade up Fifth Avenue in New York City. Nothing like the parade that Alice organized. The day was sunny and cold. The bugle sounded at 1 o'clock, and the head of the column started from Washington Arch northward. Following a platoon of mounted police and a mounted suffrage guard of honor, I had the privilege to march along with Nassau National officers and the Empire State Campaign Committee. Then came organization after organization of women carrying their colors and flags and banners with inscriptions and bands playing. Every county, every city in the state was represented. Other campaign states sent delegations. As we marched, they poured out of side streets into the avenue to take their place in the column. Late in the afternoon, 5,000 school teachers arrived and joined us with their bands playing and carrying blackboards with inscriptions for their banners. 6 o'clock came, and more marchers joined the throngs. Shop girls, clerks, stenographers, nurses now off duty. Anyone who could not be there before was there now, singing songs and locking arms in solidarity. This resulted in the largest parade in American history up to that point, with totaling over 50,000 strong. When we lost the vote, some wept bitterly, and some swore like the soldiers in Flanders. Upon hearing the devastating news, Anna Shaw asked how long I would delay the next fight. And my reply, only after we get a little sleep. Our campaign will be on again tomorrow. 2 days after our defeat, we actively began the campaign for 1917, and you all know the result. Once we achieved suffrage for New York, during that day of respite, I couldn't help but reflect on our journey. Should we have ignored all the previous effort and move in a completely different direction as Alice would have us do? Would it have taken less time? An effective leader is always evaluating her decisions. Neither myself nor Alice were born when the suffrage movement began. Its infancy was a few inspired and brave women around a tea table, which matured into millions around this country, building a community for equality, town to town, door to door. They reached critical mass and a robust voice. Every state won, every piece of legislature won, every change of heart, every shift in policy was, at one time, considered impossible, until it wasn't. In 1878, hopes were raised, and a possible light at the end of the tunnel occurred. When 30 years into the campaign, Senator Sargent of California introduced the Woman Suffrage Amendment to Congress. Alas, it took another 41 years until it was proclaimed ratified on August 26, 1920. Never in the world's history had so much human progress for a class of citizens been crowded into a century. Not knowing that a suffrage amendment was being considered, my interest in woman suffrage was fired up in 1872 when I was 13. That was when I learned that women were not allowed to vote, which started a chain of thought that rankled me permanently and drove my decision as a teenager to do everything in my lifetime to gain woman suffrage. I think that one of the major differences between Alice and me is how our mothers responded to the fact that they were not allowed to vote. Her mother took her to suffrage rallies, and my mother peacefully resigned herself to the situation. I believe it was fate, not a career that eventually took me in charge. I could never forget that rank injustice to my mother. I verily believe I was born a suffragist. From that time on, anyone who tried to tell me that women should not have the right to vote was certain to get an argument. Later in life, I offered this observation about society's treatment of women. The world taught women nothing skillful and then said her work was valueless. It permitted her no opinions and said she did not know how to think. It forbade her to speak in public and said the sex had no genius. It robbed her of every vestige of responsibility and then called her weak. It taught her that every pleasure must come as a favor from men, and when to gain it, she decked herself in paint and fine feathers, as she'd been taught to do. It called her vain. When the suffrage campaign began, one could reasonably argue that as citizens, women could reasonably ask for equal treatment. Then in 1870, the word male was inserted into the Constitution, put there by the 15th Amendment, which enfranchised the Negro. That added another hurdle to overcome. Get the word male out of the Constitution. Attempts to do this cost the women of this country years of ceaseless campaign thereafter. Millions of dollars were raised, mainly in small sums, and expended with economic care. Hundreds of women gave the accumulated possibilities of a lifetime. Thousands gave years of their lives, and hundreds of thousands gave constant interest and such aid as they could. And perhaps they did not risk being arrested, but they risked their marriages, livelihoods, and family relationships. Those sacrifices are not to be taken lightly. It was a continuous, seemingly endless chain of activity. Old suffragists who forged the first links were dead when it ended. Young suffragists who helped forge the last links of the chain were not born when it began. And some of them, like Alice Paul, did not seem to respect their foremothers. I certainly did. When I was a novice suffragist in February 1890, I was awed by the women I met. It was the National Convention, marking the joining together of the National American Woman Suffrage Associations to create the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NAWSA. I was representing Iowa as a delegate, and I was about to make my very first national speech. The first day of the convention, sitting on the stage waiting my turn, is burned into my memory banks like a jolt of lightning. It was the first time I saw Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Julia Ward Howe, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage in the flesh. And I was very excited to learn their strategies. Miss Anthony, now in her 70th year, walking straight as a lath, dressed in black silk and carrying a red shawl, moved energetically among her young satellites. Gratefully, I was able to welcome the opportunity to enter her orbit as one of those satellites. And also gratefully, she became my mentor and my friend. I never imagined that 10 years later, I would assume her role as president of NAWSA. I don't believe that would have happened if I had not followed the guidance of those formidable women. I certainly had mixed feelings about taking on that role. As you can imagine, Miss Anthony's retirement from the NAWSA presidency in 1900 was an historic event. There were 3 women considered to fill her shoes: myself, Anna Howard Shaw, and Lily Devereaux Blake. Miss Shaw was a brilliant genius on the platform and had untiring energy, but it was felt she lacked the judicial temperament necessary for the presidency. Mrs. Blake was a woman of exceptional ability, but she lacked national recognition, which left me. I did not want the responsibilities of the presidency, as it would take me away from home much more than the 1/3 of the year that my husband and I had agreed upon. But George reminded me that I had already been the directive head of the movement behind the figure of Miss Anthony, who was well on in years, and he advised me to take the position. I and members of my board were elected without opposition, and the Washington Post reported. There was a touching scene when the vote for Mrs. Chapman Catt was announced. First, there was an outburst of applause, and then, as though all at once, everyone realized what she was witnessing: the passing of Susan B. Anthony as their beloved president. The deepest silence prevailed. Lifelong members of the association, who had toiled and struggled by the side of Miss Anthony, could not restrain their emotions and wept, in spite of their efforts at control. Sadly, Miss Anthony did not live long enough to see the passing of the 19th Amendment. When that was imminent, I did not want us to lose momentum. I felt like it would be like letting the air out of a very large and powerful balloon. So I proposed reorganization of the 2 million strong NAWSA members into the League of Women Voters. I don't think that would have happened if I had not been a respected leader. We would finally have the vote, but our work was not over. I spoke these words in an address to NAWSA. The time has come to shout aloud in every city and village and hamlet, and in tones as clear and jubilant that they will reverberate from every mountain peak and echo from shore to shore. The woman's hour has come, has struck. My vision for the League was to press for women's full participation as political equals, to educate women to become independent and rational voters, to educate women as to political inequities, especially at state and local levels, and to work for civil service reform. I believe the League is operating as such today. And if you are not a member of the League of Women Voters, which does not discriminate because of gender, I encourage you to join, as I feel there is still work to be done and woman equality is still nebulous. In 1940, I organized my last event, the Women's Centennial Congress, to celebrate a century of female progress. The date was 100 years after the first World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840, where women were forbidden from speaking or voting because they were women. And their presence held an insult to the Almighty if found sitting in a convention with men. For two women attending from the United States, this was a catalyst for the suffrage movement, especially the Seneca Falls Convention. I think I shall end my reverie here and implore you to set your eyes on the future. I beg you, at the close of the century ending in 20 years, to entreat women in that day to call the second Women's Centennial Congress, to review therein what women have achieved in the last century, 1940 to 2040. Arise, awake, women of America. Make a plan, a blueprint, and a resolve, for we are not going back. We may be burned alive or buried alive, but we will not surrender. When women join together with a common goal, they are a force to be reckoned with, which brings to mind the motto of my beloved mentor, Susan B. Anthony: failure is impossible.